Greetings, one and all. Me and Josh thought we'd take you on another flight out up to the Sun Absolute. It's Gurdjieff's birthday on the 13th of January, so we wanted to do one for the Gurdjieff weekend celebrations. And we wasn't sure what to talk about, so I'd sort of asked Mr. Gurdjieff, looking at my picture of him, and picked a page in my book, and it came up with heart. And so I was just going to read a little passage from the heart, about the heart. And it first says that this holy planet purgatory is for the whole of our great universe, the heart and place of concentration of all the completing results of the pulsation of everything that functions and exists in the universe. And that's on page 745 of All and Everything. And I thought, well, the heart is for us also, where everything pulsates and should be the place of concentration of everything within us. What do you think, Josh? And let me hand over to you, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, David. Yeah. I mean, again, I suppose the term heart comes up in a lot of different religious traditions and spiritual traditions, and I guess like anything, could have multiple meanings or ways of interpreting it. But I suppose, I think that's from Beelzebub's Tales, isn't it? That quote you read out.
Yes.
And he mentions purgatory, I think, a few times in the book, like the holy planet purgatory. And again, I suppose you're quite up on religious terminology, so you know that purgatory in the Christian tradition is, well, I mean, as the name would suggest, a place of purging. Again, I suppose perhaps maybe it has a bit of a negative connotation, maybe in general, maybe associated with like the fires of hell or something like that.
It is.
if you're a bad person, you go to hell, and maybe you'll undergo suffering, and maybe through that suffering you might be purged of these contaminations, or whatever we want to call them, or sins or whatever, and through that purgation process you be able to move on, I suppose. And in a way that's kind of how he talks about it in the book. Like he says that sort of like after death the different bodies of man kind of separate, like he talks of the two higher bodies, the two non-physical bodies. So he kind of says that the process of death, the second body, the Christian body, sort of separates from the first one. And I think he says it rises to a sphere that corresponds to its, I think he uses the word density, or you could just imagine it. It goes to a realm that corresponds to its character, put it that way. And then I think he speaks of a further, kind of separation that can happen where the highest body then, or what he often calls the soul, can separate from that second body. And again, kind of go on. And he says that's the holy planet purgatory is where you could say the soul goes, So you could almost link it as the soul's native realm. And I think he gives some descriptions of the planet purgatory in the book as being the most beautiful planet then that you can imagine, And yet he kind of says that although it's the most on the surface, beautiful place, and I think he says that all the in effect all the physical, let's say, then desires, or what would be the physical desires, are kind of met, on that planet, but yet the beings occupying it in a state of sorrow or suffering in a way, because they're, and the way he describes it, they're so close to the divine, to, let's say, God or the divine presence. They're so palpable for them, and yet that closeness kind of produces a sorrow in a way, because it's like being close to your lover but not being able to embrace them, or the consummation, So it's like that kind of dual nature. There's a kind of a a pleasant side or a joyous side in being in this heavenly abode and being in you could say, the direct presence of the divine. But on the other hand, the kind of suffering that goes with that, of not being able to fully embrace with it or unite it with it. And so again, he kind of looks at the planet then as purgatory, or this place of purgation as a kind of, again, just to put it in those kind of terms, purifying place that can possibly enable the soul to fully unite or blend with the source, you know. So that's, you know, one way of looking at it. Although, again, I would suggest that the kind of deaths that he talks about, or like those separations, you know, of the higher bodies from the physical, I mean, they could happen at death, but I think also they can happen in life, you know. Because again, in different traditions, there's the idea of like dying and being born again, you know, or having multiple deaths and births, like in the Sufism. They have the ideas of Fana and Baka. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation of those terms. But again, it's like, you know, you could say there are stages to the spiritual journey, or you could look at like the idea of states and stations. You know, there's certain stations, and to enter a certain station, there's a kind of a death involved. You know, or transformation. You know, in a way, you could say you die to what was your previous life. Yeah, you died to you could say you died to your previous life or way of seeing things, or even like just like the previous kind of world. You know, again, Gurdjieff has this idea of multiple worlds, and that our consciousness or our being can be centered in different worlds, and in a way to become like permanently established in a higher world. You could say something like you have to die to the lower world then, or the previous world that you. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that, like what I said, like let's say that in order to become centered in the Keston world that you have to physically die, but in a sense there is some kind of, you could say, transformation that takes place such that that world becomes your center of gravity, you know. So in a way you could say you die to your previous way of experiencing things, let's say, where I was maybe centered in the physical body, in the kind of physical world, the way of seeing things, and then this transformation can take place, and that's no longer my center of gravity, like the Keston world is, you know. So again, you could look at those, like the process of the development of the Keston body and come into like inhabit that body or that world as a process of like a death and a birth. And you could also look at that as one form of purgation, like something like, again, and I think in Gurdjieff's terms and also Ouspensky's, they say that the second body is kind of formed from a certain kind of friction. You know, again, in alchemy, the analogy of like heat and tempering, you know, a friction between yes and no, or a certain kind of suffering, you know. So again, you could look at that as a kind of purgation, where this second body or second nature can, you could say, be born, you know, fully embodied, if you like. So that, you know, you could look at purgation then not just as at this sort of like final or ultimate level, but also as a periodic kind of process, you know, like there's a certain death or purgation for the development of the second body, and another one for the third, and maybe like, you know, a kind of final one, if you want to put it that way, where the soul can, you know, fully unite with God, you know. And again, I think you kind of find in some of the Christian mystics, you do find that kind of idea, like with, I think Meister Eckhart comes to mind. Well, I think he was, again, I don't know too much historically about him, but I think he was, you know, looked down upon on the church, that, you know, they didn't like what he was, you know, promoting, because he was kind of seemed to be saying that the inmost part of the soul was God. Like there wasn't any kind of differentiation, you know. So I'd say that's one, or a couple of kind of notions of purgatory then. One is a sort of periodic process, a kind of transformation that can happen regarding the different worlds that you can kind of be born into. And also then is like, yeah, this final transformation, liberation or unification that could be linked to the soul and God, or whatever terms people might want to put that into. And also like the way he describes the heart, purgatory as the kind of equivalent of the heart of the universe. It reminds me a bit of what he says about conscience. I think maybe specifically as kind of recounted by Ouspensky in Search of the Miraculous. I think one way he kind of describes it is like the feeling. If a man could feel all his feelings at once, you know, I think he kind of equates that in a way as a kind of description of true conscience. And again, supposedly in a kind of general state of functioning, that's quite an inconceivable or apparently far off kind of experience, because it would seem that in our general way of functioning, a state, that we don't experience all our feelings kind of at once. I experience one feeling, and then that you could say that passes, and then I experience another one, you know. So it would again seem perhaps like a quite untenable position to experience all of the feelings at once, to experience like the height of hate then or anger at the same time as experiencing, I don't know, the height of joy or love or whatever, you know, experiencing the full intensity and range of all the emotions at once, you know.
It's too much. It'd be overpowering.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And again, it seems so far removed, possibly, from the kind of general state of experience or the general way that we seem to function. You know, just in that way. Again, it kind of mirrors what he says about the multiple eyes, you know, that man has. You know, his kind of psyche, if you want to put it that way, is, you could say, fractured, or it has all these multiple eyes to it. And that many of those eyes are like diametrically opposite or in character, you know, or in nature, again, like love and hate, say, in an emotional analogy. And that, again, the kind of general experience is one eye's what we kind of experience at a time and inhabit. And then like a moment later, again, so far as Gurdjieff says, then we're embodying a different eye. And that we don't tend to see that process, you know, like it kind of happens, you could say, to us obliviously, that we don't see this transition. And whatever eye is kind of operative in us, he kind of says, assumes the role of the master. You know, it takes itself to be the one true eye, if you like, and kind of operates as a king that sits on the throne. And like the way he describes it, is it kind of rules in a way as like a tyrant, you know. So again, that similar thing with conscience, having all these, being able to experience all the feelings at once. And you could possibly link that to what he says about I, or the multiple eyes, that if somehow or other those apparent boundaries could break down, like if all those eyes could be experienced simultaneously, you know. And again, like you say, it would seem to be unbearable, just as in the emotional sense, experiencing all the feelings at once would seem, you know, overwhelming and disorientating. The same way you could link with the psyche, if all those different eyes were kind of experienced simultaneously, it would seem like perhaps unbearable or disorientating in the extreme. Because again, so far as our apparent normal functioning goes, we only operate in one of those eyes at a time. And whichever one is in place, all the rest of them become invisible. You know, it's like the horse with the blinkers on. Whichever one is in the seat blocks everything else, you know, out of its vision, you know. So yeah, again, that could be another way a way of looking at purgation or suffering, you know, for those boundaries in the psyche to break down, or the boundaries between the different feelings to break down. And possibly from the kind of suffering or unrest or disorientation that might produce, there can be, like what he talks about, like a kind of a fusion. You know, if that's suffering, if the breaking down of those barriers and the contact of all those like different eyes or different feelings, which can be, you know, opposites or the whole range, that kind of friction, or could be like the heat, you know, in the alchemical sense, could produce a kind of fusion in which something new could be born, whether we look at that in terms of a new body or the higher bodies, or like what he says about real I, you know.
I wonder if then, from what you've described, that would be your conscience coming in and then helping get burnt up or cooked the things you don't need anymore, the ones that were holding you back.
Yeah, I think I think I mean that's one way of looking at it. Like, yeah, certain maybe there could be a burning away. Like again, using a sort of analogy with like I don't know, like a blacksmith or something. You know, they heat you heat the iron in the fire and you bring it out and you heat and you bash it, and like some of the carbon,
Yeah.
the impurities come off, and then you heat it in again, and you repeat that process, and it becomes purer.
And then you mold it into the shape you want.
Yeah. So you could look
doing that, but that would
yeah
conscience would have to make you aware of what was wrong and why that was wrong and what is good and why that's good of you in you.
Yeah, I mean that's like that's one way of looking at it in terms of like there could be a literal casting off, you might say, of what was unnecessary, or I suppose with the idea of like essence and personality, maybe the idea of a kind of you could say casting off of what was artificial. Again, the idea that we have this essence that's natural to us, it's our own, and in a way it's pure, but the way he describes it, it's not pure in the sense of like all good and all holy, but it's just, you could say, real. It's just not, it's what is authentic, so that doesn't have to be like in a moralistic terms of good and bad, but just this something all authentic, as opposed to what he tends to talk about as the personality as kind of artificial and acquired, and he says that those two kind of parts of man's nature have got into a mix up, so that the man in general doesn't function from his essence, or with his essence as the kind of center of gravity and dominating force. That tends to be the opposite of that the essence has become pushed into the background and covered over, like pushed into the subconsciousness that he often talks about, and that the personality, which is kind of artificial, or the way he describes it, it's not bad, it's not like a simple dyad of personality bad, essence good, but just that the personality is artificial and it's kind of mechanical. Like he describes it as a kind of apparatus, for dealing with the physical world and like interactions in social life, a way of communicating with other peoples or navigating, let's say, in the physical world, So it's, you could say, just an appropriate piece of like apparatus, a tool for dealing with the physical world. It's not bad, but it's just that, it's kind of come to dominate the show and override the essence, then, which has been pushed into the background. And again, the way he talks of the essence is as sort of native to the astral realm, So again, the essence you could link with the second body, So again, those conscience he describes as that feeling of all the feelings together, or also what can break down the buffers, the barriers between the different eyes. He describes as buffers. So conscience can be the breaking down of those barriers, so something which can facilitate an experience, you could say, of the whole, like the whole of the psyche and all these conflicting impulses, or the whole of the feelings. And maybe by doing that, there's a certain wholeness that can be born. That might be another way of looking at purgation. Partly that maybe unnecessary things or artificial things can be cast aside or put in their proper place, but also that a certain wholeness can be embraced, the idea that again, the heart, like the way he describes the heart in purgatory, the picture that comes to mind is like, you could say like a center, but it's a center that receives everything into it. Like he says, all the results of everything that's going on in the universe, like flow into it. And you could say like maybe concentrated in it or transformed, and then they flow out again, like the blood, the heart receives the blood, the whole blood of the body, whatever the character of the blood, whether it's got toxins in it or not, the heart receives all equally, you could say, So again, you could look at that process in the individual, that kind of that enabled us to embrace the totality, you could say, to embrace everything equally. Again, like the images come to my mind of some of the icons, like the Christian icons, Christ, or with the the heart on fire.
Yeah.
Or sometimes Mary, sometimes Mary is connected with that as well. Again, the ability to embrace everything, which is often related to love, that in a way it's not a kind of it's non-judgmental, you could say, or something like that. It's able to embrace everything, you know, quote unquote, the good and the bad, you know, that nature. I mean, that's one of the qualities of divine love. Or you could say, like with the Christ, you know, the story of the Christ, like the suffering of the Christ on the cross, and the idea of like taking on the sins
The
of
world.
the world, not just like one person's sins or just these sins and not those sins, you know, taking on everything. So you could look at that, perhaps that story of the Christ in terms of the story of the individual. You know, let's say if the person in general is fairly, I don't know, compassionate, then it's likely that when they look out upon the world, that the world situation, and particularly the suffering of humanity, but also you could say the suffering of animals or nature, it's likely that that will cause them suffering, you know. So in a way, the individual who has a bit of, I don't know, openness in their heart will be moved by the you know, the apparent suffering of the world, you know. So in a way, that nature, that whatever that is that feels compassion, you could say, for the suffering of humanity, you could maybe say link with that as the Christ, you know, in the individual. And there's some process that could happen, that maybe a transformation that can happen, where, like what we're talking about, there's the ability to embrace that suffering, not to, in a way, shy away from it, you know, not to, I don't know, turn the other cheek in that sense, not to look away from it in the negative sense, but to fully embrace it, you know, to actually be able to look upon it and possibly be transformed by that, you know. Because again, it would seem to be a natural reaction, you know, if I see something horrifying, you know, I don't know, on the news or something like that, the natural, you could say, reaction is to, in a sense, to, you know, is to shy away from it, is to turn away from it, you know. It would seem fairly understandable. But again, maybe the individual loses out on something by that kind of automatic reaction to it, which would seem justifiable. And they miss out the opportunity for something to be transformed, you know. Again, it would seem like some of the utterances, let's say, of Christ or other teachers, like some of them speaking about the idea that like heaven on earth is already here, you know, the kingdom of heaven's already here, but you don't see it. Again, they would seem very, almost the complete opposite of what seems to be the case in general. You know, if I look out on the world and there's people starving and there's people killing each other and, you know, all kinds of horrors going on, you'd say, well, how can that possibly be the kingdom of heaven, you know? So again, maybe there is like that transformation of the individual, like the embracing of the suffering around them and all these apparent, you know, contradictions in life, and also the embracing of the inner contradictions, you know. Maybe that's through that transformation that the kingdom of heaven could be realized to be here already, you know. Again, it would seem something very counterintuitive, but the only way
a lot myself from when I was younger. I just used to not, you know, used to go to bed at night worrying about everything and all the animals and people getting hurt. And I still,
yeah,
you know, now and then get caught out with things that are happening, but I can deal with it better now. I have to be aware of it. And like what you're saying, you take it in, you know, and I had to learn, right, all I can do is send prayers out, because I can't go and fix the world myself, except for maybe through prayer. I'm doing a prayer from the heart, that it's a genuine prayer out for alleviating the suffering of what people are going through.
Yeah, and also I suppose, like, you know, he talks about in Beelzebub, you know, I can't remember what they call it, like the command, not the commandments, but Vashiata Shamash, you know,
Ashiata Shirmash and all his
I can't remember you know what I mean.
No, not legomenisms, but I know what you mean.
You know, there's the strivings, is it?
Strivings, that's it, yes.
And one of them, like you say, is like easing the suffering. But like, I suppose they say in that sense, charity begins at home, you know. So
yeah,
if I can liberate my own suffering or transform it, then you might say that is the contribution that I can make. I mean, yeah, in terms of like external things, or I can, you know, engage in service for others, and like you're saying, there can be prayers for others. But it's like, I suppose, that idea that if at the core of my being or essence there is this kind of division and suffering going on, then in a way you might say all the other things that I try to do to ease the suffering in the world are kind of, you could say, maybe going to be distorted because they're not coming from, like you might say, a center that has found peace in itself or has overcome its own individual suffering, you know. So they might be ineffective, or you could just say they're in a sense a second-hand contribution, you know, it's valid enough, but not like perhaps the, you know, the main issue or the main contribution that I could possibly make, you know. Again, like you say, if you're a bit open to those things, those sufferings of in the world can torment you, you know. Like I say, I still remember, it's like burnt into my memory when I was, I don't know, I was obviously a young child, watching TV, probably, I don't know, 4 or 5, something like that. I was just watching a kid, you know, one of my kids' cartoon programs or whatever. And then, like, immediately after it, there was a, you know, like a typical Oxfam kind of advert, you know, just showing kids like emaciated and starving. I just remember being like, yeah, like horrified by that, and kind of like, you know, looking around me and thinking, well, hang on a minute, how come we then, like, just, you know, me, my family, and the people in my immediate circle have a nice kind of life? I mean, I wasn't, you know, rich or anything, but I wasn't starving. And how come we're going on doing these things and not addressing that? You know, addressing that. Why aren't we addressing that problem? So, like, you know, there's a big apparent contradiction there. And then after it, like, there was an advert for, it must have been around Christmas time, there was like an advert for, I don't know, some food company, and there was just this massive table of like a Christmas spread with turkey and, you know, just mountains of food, and a happy family, you know, dancing around the Christmas table and tucking into all this food. So again, the apparent contradiction was just like, you know, again, overwhelming for me as a young child, you know. So again, in typical, that's just one example of like being exposed to, you could say, an apparent extreme contradiction, like, and something that is unreconciled. I didn't know how to reconcile that apparent contradiction. Like, well, there's a part of the world that isn't suffering, and there's a part of the world that is, and there doesn't seem to be much being done about it. But you could liken that to anything, just the child in general being exposed to, I mean, it's a popular word nowadays, but trauma, you know, various kinds of it, you know, and those experiences, you could say, are overwhelming to the young child. And again, Gurdjieff talks about it as like the essence. It's not able to handle, let's say, those kind of shocks, you know, in the way that he would talk about it. And so that stuff just gets pushed into the subconscious, and it remains there unresolved. And you could say, as long as it is unresolved or untransformed, it kind of, you know, it's kind of toxic.
No.
You know, it'll be toxic in some way. You know, you'll get no peace, and it'll kind of contaminate, you could say, the way, you know, your life, your inner life and your outer life, you know. So again, another part of purgation could be looking at it that way. Like, you know, the child undergoes various kinds of sufferings, whether apparently more intense or less intense, depending on the life it leads. But you could say, in general, every child is traumatized, wounded, you know, and those wounds get pushed into the background and they don't get addressed, you know. They become a subconscious influence. And then you might say, like, again, purgation would be like the process of bringing those wounds to the surface so that they could, you know, be transformed or be healed. Again, another idea of like the Christ or love as a healer, you know. Come to me, all you who are heavy and burdened, you know, with the sufferings of the world and your own, maybe sufferings of your own self, like, oh, I'm not a good person, I could be a better, you know, or whatever, or maybe things you've done in your life. So that your own sufferings, your own sins, iniquities, and also those of the world, come to me with them, because my yoke is light. You know, I'm
Light's your load, isn't it? He's going to fill us with light in both senses of the word. Light as in heaviness, take away the heaviness, but also take away our darkness, so we are filled with light.
Yeah. Again, I tend to see that as something that is able to kind of embrace the apparent contradiction and like the suffering that comes from that, and transform it, not necessarily in just like remove, like, again, like one of the typical ideas that, oh, back in the Bible, Christ, the new Messiah, is going to come and he's going to like slay all the bad guys, and he's going to establish this new peaceful physical kingdom. So there's going to be external physical reform. Everybody's going to be living in a kind of Garden of Eden, but that didn't seem to happen. Evidently, he was apparently crucified on the cross, and externally speaking, things pretty much, for the most part, seem to have remained the same. The same bad things still, seem to go on. So maybe, like I say, the transformation might be like a new way of seeing, or a transformation of meaning, or a new way of understanding the apparent sufferings of the world. Like that. Like sometimes he speaks of it'll be changed in the twinkling of an eye. So that could be that transformation in terms of a new way of seeing, a new way of looking at the suffering of the world, a new way of understanding it. That kind of transformation.
Well, I think it's a personal transformation he was telling us to go for.
Yeah.
To work with, yes.
Yeah. So I think that it's like that kind of redemption or salvation, and it's a change in, you could say, a change in the meaning, and you could also say that's perhaps what is primarily meant by a change of world.
Mm-hmm.
Like, again, like, isn't there the analogy in the Bible, like two women will be sitting at the spinning wheels, or two men will be working in the field, and one will be taken and the other won't be. So again, externally, the two people appear to be the same. They're both digging in the field, or they're both working on the spinning wheel. But you might say internally they'll be occupying different worlds. Like you could say a change of perception, a change of meaning. And again, that might be what is meant by a change of world. I don't have to like physically leave my body to enter the Keston world then, or the world of the soul. But it's like more of a change of meaning, a change of perspective. Things take on, appear in a new light, but not because they're physically changed, but because you could say the understanding has changed.
The inner working has changed. Once your inner working starts changing for a more considerate way, you do transform within. It's not what well, it is also what comes out of your mouth. It doesn't matter what we take in, it's what comes out that's important.
Yeah, like he says, so it's not what goes in the mouth that defiles you, but what comes out. And again, I think in that he's referencing the difference between the world. What comes out of the mouth, in the sense, is what comes from the inner world, or is informed by the inner world. And obviously what goes in the mouth is, physical food. So yeah, like as you say, the world, I mean, I don't want to equate it with a simplistic thing of like, well, okay, then if there's been this inner transformation, then you will just behave good, as the ordinary understanding of that, or the normal conception of that. Because again, like in terms of the essence isn't strictly like, it doesn't just have to be good, but it's what's authentic. So I mean, yes, that transformation could influence a person's external behavior. For other people looking on, maybe they become a nicer person, or do better things, but maybe it wouldn't necessarily starkly change their external actions, or wouldn't necessarily be visible to other people that anything perhaps had changed. Because if it's a kind of esoteric inner transformation, then it's not necessarily going to be visible on the surface to people.
But it might start making them think twice before they do something or say something, which might be important, and then they don't do something stupid or something evil, or their conscience might start speaking to them, and they might be listening to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would see that as a prior stage to the kind of transformation that I'm talking about, in the sense that, prior to that, we can get, like he says, the conscience is in the subconsciousness, and we can receive little, communications from it, or directions from it. But if that has become, I don't know, embodied, like that kind of transformation that we talk about, then you could say that becomes the driving force. It's no longer that I'm separate to the conscience and I'm receiving guidance from it. You could say I'm fully embodying it, in the sense that has become the authority. Again, in the Bible, some of them, is it maybe Paul? I don't know. Some of them talk about like, oh, I'm a slave to Christ, or the Christ.
But
not
that's
my
when
work.
not I, but Christ in me. That's when that
Yeah,
becomes that. And the more you say that, the more you will start realizing, or Krishna or whoever you want to put into your heart will start working on your behalf.
yeah. So in that sense, yeah.
Right. So I wanted to ask you, Josh, because we were talking about the subconscious. And I used to wonder this, and I wanted to ask Mr. Gurdjieff himself, does the subconscious talk through our mind or our heart, or could it be both?
Well, I suppose, like you might say, traditionally speaking, I suppose, using those terms, it would be more associated with the heart. But it could, why not? It could communicate, I suppose you could say, to us or through us, through the mind or the heart or the body. Again, it's a kind of, I think he uses the term subconscious a bit differently to perhaps how it's kind of generally talked about today in, like, psychological terms, although there is some overlap. Because like you could say, he says, doesn't he, that the kind of subconsciousness is what he calls the real consciousness, as compared to what we call our waking consciousness, our waking state. He says it's kind of fictitious, it isn't really consciousness, So again, that kind of flips things on its head, particularly from like you could say a perspective of like how can I work on myself or something like that, because generally speaking, everything that I do or try to do is by way of my waking consciousness. Most of what I do is informed by the ideas that I have access to or required, you could say, through my waking consciousness. So yeah, most of my efforts then to work on myself proceed through like this waking consciousness, which he says, like, all the in some of his stark words, he kind of says is almost meaningless, or is almost, valueless if it's coming from that side of our nature. Again, if we linked it with the essence and the personality, if the subconscious is kind of related to the essence, then if most of my work is just proceeding at the level of the personality, then in a sense it's just artificial, Anyway, I might have a deep longing or an authentic drive, motivation, like that you might say, that's situated in the essence or the subconsciousness. But the way in which that gets acted upon or is like interpreted, you could say, is filtered through the waking consciousness, which is just informed, you could say, essentially by like all the ideas that I've acquired from other people since I was a child, So yeah, I would say that, yeah, the subconsciousness could manifest through anything, but traditionally speaking, yeah, it's associated with the heart, because again, I think in terms of traditions, spiritual or religious traditions, what they mean by the heart is not necessarily emotion. I mean, it can't possibly express that way, but I think they often speak of heart as the center of consciousness itself. So again, in that sense, you could relate the heart with the subconsciousness itself. It's you could say the true core of our being, or like you might say, our real consciousness. And again, like, it would seem that if we linked it with the essence, the way he speaks of the essence as being like not of the planet, not of the physical world, like he said, world 24, the astral world, then you could say that that side of our nature isn't time bound in the way that our physical nature and physical consciousness appears to be. Again, like, our waking consciousness appears to have that experience of linearity and succession. I do one thing at a time. I'm aware of this, and then you might say that passes out of my awareness, and then I'm aware of the next thing. Like the image of reading comes to mind. I'm looking at, when I'm reading, I look at this word, then my eyes move to the next word, and when they move to that word, the previous word, in a sense, is gone. It's not directly in my attention anymore. So that kind of consciousness, you could say, proceeds kind of in linearity and in succession. And in a sense, it only has a small, it's like a small aperture, like you're looking out of a small window, or a keyhole. You're looking through a keyhole, so you can only see what directly passes in front of that window. And when it goes by, you can't see it anymore, So it only has a small aperture and only operates, you could say, like, in time. or one thing at a time. So in a sense, that consciousness, which you could link with the waking, the waking consciousness, or perhaps even the personality, it doesn't have much opportunity, you could say, because it's limited, appears limited to time and to a small like aperture of awareness, And again, a lot of the practices, I suppose, that are centered around like being present and being in the now, again, there can be benefits, obvious, evident benefits from that, like being aware of what's happening now, being aware of whatever thought is happening or whatever feeling or, what sensations are going on. They could, pretty much anybody would report that there can be a kind of benefit from that. But I suppose if the work is only operating on that level, then you could say it's going to be quite limited, because again, it's still that form of consciousness only has access to, you could say, that limited form of present moment. And again, it's kind of a question you could ask someone, like if they're talking about being present or being in the now, you could say, well, what do you mean by the present moment? Or, what do you mean by now? What are you referring to? And again, generally speaking, all that's being referred to is what can be pointed at directly, Like again, so far as you could say my waking consciousness goes, the attention of it, all I can perceive, like via the senses, is the content of this room. I can only see as far as the walls, and so there's a kind of a horizon to my perception with my eyes, and also you could say there's a similar horizon to my inner attention. I can only perceive whatever feeling you might say is currently present, or whatever thought is currently present. It has to enter that apparent sphere of attention or awareness in order for me to be aware of it. So in a way, it's quite a narrow bandwidth, from just operating by let's say the waking consciousness. Whereas like that subconsciousness or the essence, if we said that the waking consciousness is kind of time bound, then it would be like saying that the essence or the subconsciousness is kind of like eternal. It would have another kind of dimensionality to it. If my waking consciousness operates, let's say, in 3 dimensions, then obviously it has no notion of what a 4th dimension would be. It can't, it can't perceive that. But again, just using that as an analogy, then the essence would kind of be like 4th dimensional. Or using the analogy of linear time, then the essence or subconsciousness would kind of be eternal. So again, one idea of that is that the subconsciousness is kind of co-present in all the moments of our life. Like it has direct access to, let's say, everything that's ever happened to you in the past. And you might also say then by extension, it also has access to everything in the future. It doesn't experience things from a time-bound perspective,
It does. I hadn't thought of that before. Yes.
Again, like you can use that analogy, of like, I think Ouspensky uses it in Essential Miraculous. Like the difference between a point and then a line, and then the difference between a line to a plane, and then a plane to a solid, and then you go, okay, well, what would be the equivalent next step up? You go from a solid to what? Again, each one of those kind of steps, in a sense, is unimaginable. Like if I only lived in a 2-dimensional world, I would have no conception of what a 3-dimensional object would be. So you could use that same kind of comparison. The waking consciousness has you might say, no conception of what the subconsciousness is like in that way of looking at it. And one way of imagining is, it's the same, that it has access to, you could say, all time, all the moments of our past, present, and future life, you might say. For that subconsciousness, all of that is now. That's what would constitute its now, not just a moment of time, but all, like the whole of time, or all of our lifeline, And again, I think in some of the old terminology, that is what literally was meant by consciousness. It was that which encompassed, and you might say facilitated, the individual's whole life experience or life duration. Like I suppose consciousness in that sense would be the thread and every experience or moment would be like a pearl that was threaded onto the thread that was encompassed by and held together. So I think for the subconsciousness, everything we've ever experienced, just say the past then for the moment, is present for it now directly. It's like that side of us it doesn't just remember last Tuesday, but it is in last Tuesday. It's actually in those moments. So again, I think the nearest glimpse in general people have of that is what Ouspensky calls the moments of self-remembering. And he equates them with what we can really remember. Again, it tends to be stark experiences, either altered experiences or spiritual experiences, or just intense experiences. They're the things that really stick out in our memory. And in a way, there's a certain quality to those memories. Again, they're vivid, and they seem to be, in a way, living. Like if that kind of a memory is triggered, if I put my attention on some of those memories, again, it's not really, it doesn't have the sense that I'm just remembering something or that I'm looking at a memory, some past event. It's like I'm looking at something that is happening now. It's still there. I'm still in that moment, in a sense, So I'd say, that like the subconscious has access to that whole lifespan, and in a way, that's why you could say it's linked to the essence, because it's our totality, And again, you have there's all those ideas of like a higher self, having a certain kind of information that we can like be informed by, or our essence having a certain type, a certain nature, a certain pattern that is eternal, but gets expressed, through our physical nature and personality in time. It's an eternal thing, but it can unfold itself in a lower dimension, in a linear sequence of a lifetime. Again, the idea that your life mirrors your essence, or sometimes Gurdjieff says your being attracts your life. So the physical lifespan, you could say, is an apparent playing out in time of this non-temporal, eternal, essence. And again, like some understanding might possibly blossom where that can be realized, like the pattern of the essence can kind of awaken or be seen, and it could be seen how that is influencing our physical life. It's like it'd be something like a character in, I don't know, a book or something, or a TV program, waking up and kind of realizing that they were a character in a play, and realizing the part that they had to play, saying, oh, this is my role, and this is how it fits into the larger story. So again, like we could receive influences supposedly from the subconsciousness, like again via, you might say, the conscience as a medium of communication, and then hopefully, like you say, some transformation might take place where we come to embody that other side of our nature, or like he says, the center of consciousness can shift, from the waking consciousness to the subconsciousness. Again, like what we were saying with the eyes, the buffers breaking down, or the boundaries between the different emotions breaking down, it's quite an unimaginable transformation. Like say, if I suddenly went from my waking consciousness to my subconsciousness, then it would seem to be unfathomable in the sense like, oh, I'd suddenly be having an extra dimensional experience. I wouldn't be experiencing myself as, let's say, then just in this moment in time, but I'd also be, you could say, co-present in all the other, like you could say, past moments of my life and maybe future moments of my life.
That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah.
But then we've got to be, this is why we're doing all this training and exercises, because all them sitting exercises, for example, are to help you become aware of what it's like to be like that, even though it is difficult to, our attention doesn't stay with our sitting exercises, do they? But over time, our attention lasts a bit longer and longer and longer, so that then we can implement that into our lives.
Yeah, you could look at them as like, well, I suppose just like an analogy would be like just like going to the gym. or doing physical exercise.
Mm.
In a sense, physical exercise isn't an end in itself, but if I'm physically, let's say if I was physically fit, then it would enable me to do certain things. I don't know, like if I suddenly had to run, I don't know, run away from a tiger or something. You know, if I was physically fit, I might have a better chance. You know, I'd be a bit more equipped, you know, to do that.
So you wouldn't suddenly turn
So,
around and be able to talk to the tiger and
oh
tame
well,
the
yeah,
tiger,
maybe,
you know, like the true gurus.
yeah,
The
maybe,
tigers
yeah,
walk with
you know.
them.
Yeah, only if you're at the highest level of sainthood. But I'm just saying in that sense that, yeah, you know, you could, the term exercise is quite appropriate there, in the sense it's like just make it's, you know, it's making the vessel or the apparatus, the tool, able to be used, you know, or like what you're saying, maybe those kind of exercises are like, I mean, he talks about, I think maybe as a preparation, I think that's one name for one of the exercises, because it maybe prepares the, I don't know, the body or the waking kind of consciousness or psyche to be able to handle like what we're talking about as a kind of, you know, unfathomable transformation, you know, because again, if our normal self and identity only functions by the very virtue of being segregated, like in a sense my normal identity is bound up with me not experiencing these other sides of myself, and if they were suddenly experienced, then you would say that would be like, you know, the ultimate identity crisis, because my that part of myself that I'd identified with wouldn't be no longer central anymore. You know, you could say it would just be one among one of the eyes among these multiple eyes. You know, so the exercises in that sense can be a bit of a possibly a kind of preparation. But again, I think you'll find it in some of Gurdjieff's, you know, sayings that in a way, I mean, that's, you could say that that's all that we, in terms of the waking consciousness and the personal kind of intentionality can do. But in a sense, that's never adequate enough. And in a sense, it's always something that comes from above or from behind the scenes, or, you know, grace. There's all those terms that come in. It's only something else that in a way can do that, can do that transformation or can handle it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite interesting you used the word identity crisis. And I know some people did have an identity crisis going through the start of changing in their Gurdjieff work. Thankfully, they survived and saw it through. You know, and I'm sure that's all their different eyes were screaming, I'm
Yeah,
the one.
yeah. Just, you know, just like it just throws everything, you know, into question. You know, like everything that perhaps that seems to be solid and real and self-evident will be like undermined, or will be, you know, brought into question. You know, like that no longer have a solid footing. You know, again, I suppose there's that idea, isn't it? Like before I don't know, something can be created or something new, there has to be, like you might say, the destruction of the present. Or again, the classic analogy comes to mind with the caterpillar. I mean, that's one of the most radical transformations in nature that we're aware of. And like, you know, so far as science has studied it, the caterpillar goes into its cocoon and it completely liquefies. All the structure or apparent structure is dissolved. It's just
It's all gooey, as I said when I was.
yeah, it becomes a goo. It's just a goo. You know, so again, like you could ask that question. Well, where is the caterpillar, or the caterpillar that was? When I'm now looking at just this bit of goo, or like, well, where is the butterfly? You know, so that apparent middle stage there would, again, if we just like anthropomorphized it, we could say, imagine being the caterpillar in that experience, that you're like melting into a goo. You've only known yourself as a caterpillar, the world of a caterpillar. That's all you've ever known, and now suddenly that's dissolving. Your whole world, like it'd be like the Matrix. I don't know. That's another analogy that comes to mind. You know, when Neo takes the pill and then he like touches the mirror and it suddenly becomes like liquid, and then like he loses consciousness and wakes up in a, you know, in the little pod. So again, that's quite an apt analogy for the poor old caterpillar. You know, you're like the whole world, everything, you know, you've apparently known everything you valued or everything you've seen to be true and real, the whole, you know.
I had the analogy of Jeff Goldblum on the top of a fly going, "Help me!"
Yeah, exactly.
I went a bit the wrong way, but
well, it's the same thing. But again, just the idea of like, radical transformation, and like in the sense that something that's totally unfathomable and all-encompassing. Like again, the transformation between the two, it's as big of a like I don't know, a difference or a change as is possible. Like again, the idea with being like born. Again, they use that analogy for like inner transformation, because again, physically speaking, that's kind of the biggest transformation that we know of. Like as an individual, I was born at some point, although I might not have any memory of that. Or the idea of like, well, when does consciousness begin? Like, I was a clump of cells, apparently, up until a certain point in time, and then suddenly, bang, my sense of self and consciousness or awareness appeared on the scene. And theoretically speaking, in terms of imagination, that would be quite a big shock, to go from not experiencing anything, to experiencing, the whole world. It's quite radical transformation. So again, those analogies are kind of used for this further kind of transformation that can happen. But again, it's as radical as anything that can be imagined, and as intense.
I've said before
So
to people about always check your astrological birth chart. And then I was talking to some people about that, and they like Gurdjieff, they study Gurdjieff as well. So we got into a debate about, so maybe it comes when you are actually born because all the stars are making you or molding you, but then you're already a human being. So when does the consciousness go in? Or is that because I think he says your astrological chart is your essence, isn't it? But then we change as personality comes along. And I know I've read somewhere Gurdjieff saying, it was not in the books, it's in meetings of some kind. You are here to break your astrology, break that chart and go off on a different tangent. Like that chart is fixed, but you can break that.
Yeah. Again, it comes back to that the idea, I suppose, in terms of a sequence, that first there kind of has to be a reclaiming of the essence. Like because we've become distorted, we're not living as our essence, so we have to kind of come back to the natural world, so to speak. And then there can be a further possible transformation going, like, you might say, to the supernatural world, or what he takes as the soul and real I, But again, theoretically speaking, well, that's only something that's possible for the essence. So the essence would have to come to the forefront to enable for that to be a possible transformation. And I think, again, maybe what he's speaking about with that going beyond breaking the astrological chart is, like we said, the essence is a specific type. It's one facet of the total, the human essence. It's one expression of the human essence, this particular way. So to come to the total human essence, like the essential human essence, you'd have to get beyond just your facet, or to embrace the whole diamond. You'd have to be able to not just be one side of it, one face of it, but to embrace it. And again, I think that's what they mean with the Christ, when they talked about as the Son of Man. You could just say that's like the totality of the human essence. You might say the single human essence that every person is an expression of. So it's be like returning to the heart, returning to the heart. Or like some of the Christian ideas, that would be to become the Christ, not just to worship or try to imitate the Christ, which is fair enough. But that maybe the inner side of that would be to be, to become that.
Well, that's what I think is the misunderstanding in the religious institutions. They're too busy saying we're teaching you how to be like the Christ, when I think we have the possibility in us to become the Christ by welcoming the Christ into us, and then we can work on ourselves so that we can become Christ-like. And I know many people see that as blasphemous, but I think he's trying to help us all take that Christ energy in. Because it comes from the Holy Spirit, and from he became Christ when he was baptized by John the Baptist, and the dove came down, Holy Spirit, and gave him the Christ energy. So we can all work towards that if we're worthy.
I mean, I think it's just a story of, you know, the story of the birth of Christ and the crucifixion and resurrection. I think it's just a story of the person, you know, the human. In a way, it's everybody's story. It's your story. It's my story. We were all we were all born of a virgin, in the sense that
as well.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah. We were all born of a virgin, in that sense that, well, we appeared out of thin air. You know, we like you say, so far as linear memory goes, I can look back in my memory, but I will reach a point where I can't go beyond. You know, I'll reach a blackness, let's just say. But, you know, so in the sense, I can't see through linear memory my origin. So in that sense, like, I had a virgin birth, in the sense that I don't know who my father is. You know, he was behind the scenes. I just suddenly appeared on the scene. You know, I don't have an origin story past a certain point. So in that sense, like, yeah, we all came on the scene through a virgin birth and like a blank slate, in that sense, apparently, you know, not having a past. And we, you know, you could say we all go through that playing out of the story, like, you know, taking on the sins of the world, learning about all the horrors, and developing a personal identity, who we think we are, and then maybe we have some encounter, you know, with someone or something, you know, like a baptism, and we wake up to, you might say, our real, you know, human essence, who we really are. And, you know, we might have to go through.
Is it a Persian story about the prince that was sent down?
Exactly, yeah.
And then got trapped here because he suddenly, you know, fell in love with this world and then forgot all about the other world, the original world, the real world.
Yeah, all the metaphors, like, yeah, you know, you're sent down there to, like, have a, you know, survey the kingdom and, you know, see what's going on, or sometimes to retrieve a pearl of treasure. But yeah, you know, you get lost on the way. You forget about that. Well, it's just like, you know, I in a sense, I take on this limited and, like, fallible, partial identity. You know, I identify myself as Josh, who was born to so and so parents, who was born in such and such a time, and, you know, whereas you might just say, well, okay, that maybe that's one part of what I am, but at a deeper level, no, I'm, you know, I am the all and everything. You know, again, it can be quite a stark, or again, unfathomable, or possibly blasphemous notion to suggest, or to exclaim, I am God, you know, like Christ. You might get crucified for it.
People were executed for that and burnt at the stake by the Catholic Church for declaring that. I can't even remember who was the most famous one. I don't think it was Marnie, but anyway, but people were, you know, because they came to what you've just said, not that they thought they were a god. And even, you know, David Icke himself said that on the Wogan show, but he was trying to say we're all gods, but people obviously didn't understand. And then, you know, the next day it's all David Icke thinks he's the, you know, the Messiah.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it's funny in that sense that everybody, in a way, maybe whether explicitly or implicitly, you could say has a Messiah complex, because everybody is the Messiah. He's not the Messiah. He's just a very naughty boy.
Naughty boy, yes.
So again, that could be, you know, a bit of a rather a considerable possible shock. You know, let's say if I'm coming from a fairly exoteric perspective or tradition, yeah, obviously that whole idea would be blasphemous. But if that sort of realization started to dawn in me, that could be terrifying. You know, I might think I'm being taken over by the devil. Like, oh no, you know, I've got these, you know, suggestions that I am God. I am that I am. You know, or yeah, it just could be rather shocking. You know, again, if I've spent my apparent whole life thinking that I'm just this little individual, this little character, you know. Like I say, like the caterpillar, you know, it could be quite a shock to turn to goo and then to wake up out of the goo and oh, I've got wings, you know. Look at my fancy wings.
You have to go through that little bit of suffering, that panic of what's happening to me. And
Yeah,
then once you
the
come,
da-
which they, you know, I suppose in alchemy and the other esoteric ways, you know, this is your dark night of the soul and things like that.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay, all the different metaphors for it,
Hmm.
and I suppose yeah, the dark night, yeah, because it can be suffering and everything can be brought into question, and also like yeah, you know, I suppose like the caterpillar is concealed, isn't he, in the cocoon in a way whilst he's going through that transformation. He's in the dark, you know. He becomes almost like nothing, you know, in order to be born again.
Well, we were doing this to celebrate Gurdjieff's birthday, and I thought it was great that we actually managed to get round to the idea of birth and such like.
Yeah, yeah.
And you've still got your tapestry of Beelzebub up as a blog on the website, and I still have Hermes Risen magazine going. And you know, please look at both of our works. And I would like to thank you very much, Josh,
Thank you,
for
Debbie. Yeah.
speaking today. And I'd like to thank Mr. Gurdjieff for transforming into the butterfly that he was, and who help us hopefully become not too gooey, but
Yeah. Yes. Was it what is it that Ruby says? May your need increase, you know? May you know
yeah,
the longing or the drive, you know, increase in you so it becomes more necessary to you than air, and then it can't but help, you know, it can't help but happen if it becomes necessary.
I've been reading a lot of Rumi lately, and I went to a Rumi workshop all about the love, obviously. But he was one of the few people that understood unconditional, compassionate love. And that's what I think Gurdjieff is trying to teach us all as well.
Yeah, and also the joy, you know, like I read his poetry or Hafiz, you know, the other Persian poet, or Hafez, however you pronounce it. And to me, it's imbued with that kind of joy, you know. It's again, you might say, an expression of the essence, you know, childlike. You know, it's no longer like what Christ says that my yoke is light. It's not burdened with all this heaviness and the apparent woes and seriousness. You know, it doesn't really. You could say it doesn't take anything serious in that sense. It's play. It's joyful. You know, it's natural.
Exactly. And I must admit, I have annoyed a few people recently who are doing too much doom scrolling, and I'm telling them, just go and enjoy your life.
Yeah. No, Debbie, it's too important. These things matter. You know, my suffering is too important. Like Gurdjieff said, again, it's so counterintuitive that the thing that man holds on to the most is his own suffering.
Yeah.
You'd think that would seem completely counter. I mean, well, that's the last thing, you know, I want, you know, that would seem the case, but apparently not. No, that's what we cling to. Or like the idea that Bennett mentioned. I can't remember where, J.G. Bennett, you know, student of Gurdjieff, said that again, just put it in sort of religious terms, that man's failing, if you want to put it that way, that he was unable to accept that he was already saved, that he couldn't, that was just too good to be true for him, you know. So again, it wasn't like he's too bad to be saved, he's too damned to be saved, but in a sense, he's too like you say, something like self-judgmental. He can't accept the beauty of it. It's, you know, it seemed too good to be true. Again, how could the kingdom of heaven be here already? That would you know. Or like what Gurdjieff said, just bringing it back to him. I think he mentioned in I don't know, maybe it's quoted in The Women of the Rope. Again, he was talking about, this was after he'd had his accident, you know, after the car crash, and he kind of says in a way that he was born again after that. you know, and that comparatively he used to be things were so heavy and dark and serious. And then he said after that everything like was kind of full of light. He said, you know, maybe I think they were maybe celebrating his birthday. And he was saying like, oh, I'm only actually like 11 years old or 10 years old, you know, like after that accident I was kind of, you know, born again.
Yeah. Well, happy birthday, Mr. Gurdjieff, and thank you, Josh. It's been
No
great.
worries.
Thank you, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you again next time. And just enjoy your life.
Yeah, for God's sake.
Oh, I can't see the button.